have the written materials, and feel free to email me, and we can also meet over Zoom if anything is unclear that is online. So there are no marks then for attendance, and there's no face-to-face meeting. So it is up to you how you manage your time. You will also be given a great deal of choice in terms of the presentation assignments and in terms of the final assignment. And the take-home test will involve short answer concepts. So for example, if you are asked to define performativity on the take-home test, then you can look at the lecture slides and the reading for this week, which is a reading by Judith Butler, written by Judith. So the lecture is about hate speech and performativity. And the article about interest speech acts was written by Judith Butler. So this is a clip of Judith Butler.
What are clothes made for?
So Judith Butler is best known for gender theory. And so Judith Butler's works regarding gender performativity are among the most well-cited scholarship in gender studies. And Judith Butler's writings about gender really changed the ways that gender theorists and theorists of the liberal arts and humanities thought about gender. So previous to the writings of Judith Butler, many scholars thought that sex, meaning the sex that you were assigned at birth, was natural, and that gender was constructed. So before Judith Butler's writings regarding gender performativity, it was assumed that when a child was born, the child was naturally male or female, and gender was an enactment of this kind of innate identity assigned at birth. Judith Butler's writings challenge us to think about gender as a performative. So in the book Gender Trouble, what Butler argues is that when a child is born and the doctor says it's a girl or it's a boy, or someone says it's a girl or it's a boy, they are not describing the existence of reality. They are, in essence, constructing reality. So they're making meaning out of certain parts of the human body. And the meaning that is made has consequences throughout the course of one's life. And the consequences are really about the enactment of a set of gender performatives under a sign, male or female, that one is forced to perform under. And if someone departs from this series of performatives, if one was born under the sign of female and they do things that are considered to be masculine, there are a whole series of actions from verbal discipline to punishment to exclusion that can happen. Canada has comprehensive rights now, protecting the rights of transgender people and non-binary people. So Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. And so gender one cannot be discriminated against because of their chosen gender identity or expression of gender. So Judith Butler's writings come about at a time when people are questioning the enforcement of gender norms. What is interesting about this article that is on the syllabus this week is that Judith Butler's writings about the enactment of performative speech acts that lead to a whole series of sedimented processes, ways of speaking, ways of acting, uh, then lead to the illusion of a stable gender identity. So, speaking in a certain voice, sitting in a certain way, appearing in a certain way, all lead to this illusion of a stable gender identity. Performativity is not the same as performance. It is not as though one can just simply enact a different set of gender performatives. From the time that one is born, they are told that they are a girl or a boy. And so the ways that we sit, the ways that we speak, and our actual mind has been formed in this gendered imaginary. From a queer and feminist perspective, Judith Butler's writings have real political consequences. So if you are born under the sign of female or girl or woman, then the ways that your mind is formed and the ways that your speech acts are formed, the ways that your patterns of behavior are formed, and your occupation of space in the world, even your actual human body, could mean that you are at a disadvantage in certain ways, so that you could be socialized to not be an aggressive competitor, and therefore you could make less money. Uh, you could also be socialized to be submissive and timid, and uh, this could mean that people take advantage of this enactment of gender performativity. So Butler's scholarship also has consequences, obviously, for the rise of transgender and queer rights. So in this article, Butler uses similar arguments to discuss the burning of crosses and hate speech and the ways that acts of speech or signification, meaning the signifying of certain ideas using symbols or using acts that involve the body or words, um, is not innocent. It does not exist as a kind of free choice or form of free will outside of history. So when someone decides to sit with their legs crossed or wear a dress. Obviously, this is not an act of just free will. There is a whole process of gender socialization and a whole set of gender norms that leads one to make these choices or leads one to perform under these signs. The same could be said of burning a cross. If one was raised in a different context outside of North America, burning a cross would not make sense. This is also true of what gender performatives are like in other countries, in other contexts, in other historical time periods. So I'll begin by playing this clip of Judith Butler discussing gender.
So there are many different theories of gender, and mine is just one. Sometimes people who really hate gender name me as the one who made this up, but that's actually not true. You know, in my view, everybody has a theory of gender. And what I mean by that is that everybody has certain assumptions going about what gender is or should be. And at a certain point in life, we ask ourselves, wow, where did that assumption?
I had to pause it for a second because of technical difficulties. Hopefully this will happen again. This is only the first week. Sometimes the screen share pauses for some reason, and I don't know why. So Judith Butler is best known for gender. And so before I discuss the articles regarding the burning of crosses, I will play this clip because it allows you to think about Judith Butler's work and the purpose of their work as a philosopher.
What are clothes made for? If they're not made to be lived in. Marks. Hey, girl. Hey. Ooh, Lanesh. My lips so need that love, that KAT hair mask. Your hair looks so soft pink and this. This rare beauty blush was made for you. The brands everybody's talking about. Only at Sephora.
So there are many different theories of gender, and mine is just one. Sometimes people who really hate gender name me as the one who made this up, but that's actually not true. You know, in my view, everybody has a theory of gender. And what I mean by that is that everybody has certain assumptions going about what gender is or should be. And at a certain point in life, we ask ourselves, wow, where'd that assumption come from? At this point, I'm less concerned about whose theory is right and whose theory is wrong, because the assault on gender is also an assault on democracy. We have the power and the freedom to make more livable lives for ourselves, where bodies can be more free to breathe, to move, to love without discrimination and without fear of violence. I am Judith Butler, distinguished professor in the graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley. I teach literature, philosophy, and critical theory, and I'm most well known for my two books on gender, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter from the early 1990s. My work has been translated into more than 27 languages. I insist that what it is to be a woman, or indeed what it is to be a man or any other gender, is an open-ended question. We have a whole range of differences, biological in nature, so I don't deny them. But I don't think they determine who we are in some sort of final way. At the heart of these controversies is the distinction between sex and gender. But what is that distinction? How do we think about it? Sex is generally a category that is assigned to infants that has importance within medical and legal worlds. Gender is a mix of cultural norms, historical formations, family influence, psychic realities, desires and wishes, and we have a say in that. My early life was affected by the 1960s and the social movements that took shape during that time. I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, part of a Jewish community. And by the time I was in high school, I was politically active, but I was also taking university courses in philosophy. In my 20s, I came to see that it was not just the Jews who were apprehended and extinguished by the Nazi regime. It was queer people, it was gay, lesbian people, it was people with disabilities, people with illnesses, Polish workers, communists. And my sense was that one needed to widen the lens and see that many people have been subject to genocidal politics, and to understand that there are different forms of oppression. I remain convinced that one does need to know history in order to make sure it does not repeat, and that one wants justice not just for the group to which one belongs, but for any group that suffers in a similar way. In the 70s and 80s, I was part of a movement of people who were rethinking gender during that time. Queer theory was emerging. It was in a complicated conversation with feminism. Trans issues had not yet surfaced as part of our contemporary reality. So it was a moment in which we asked questions like, what is society made of us and what can we make of ourselves? There were a number of versions of feminism that I tended to oppose. One of them held that, well, women are fundamentally mothers and that maternity is the essence of the feminine. And then a second one thought that feminism was about sexual difference, but the way they defined sexual difference was always presumptively heterosexual. And both of them struck me as wrong. I was pretty committed to the idea that people ought not to be discriminated against on the basis of what they do with their body, if they, who they love or how they move or how they look. All I was saying is that the sex you're assigned at birth and the gender that you are taught to be should not determine how you live your life.
You can skip this video, but you can't skip the truth. Right now in North Gaza, children are going.
Sometimes people point to gender trouble as the inception of gender theory, but people were working on gender before me, Gail Rubin and Juliet Mitchell and Simone de Beauvoir herself. Simone de Beauvoir was an existential philosopher and a feminist philosopher who wrote The Second Sex in the 1940s. The basic point was that one is not born a woman, but rather becomes one, that the body is not a fact. She opened up the possibility of a difference between the sex you're assigned and the sex you become. Gail Rubin was an anthropologist and remains an anthropologist who wrote an extremely influential article called The Traffic in Women. And what she tried to say was that the family was a structure whose task it was to reproduce gender. And one of the aims it had was to kind of keep heterosexuality looking really normal. And although it was part of feminist anthropology at the time, it allowed us to start thinking about gender as something that could be reproduced, crafted, cultivated, and that there were systems, frameworks to which gender belongs. There was one other dimension of Rubin's work, which was, interestingly, psychoanalysis. She basically said, well, maybe there's a whole lot of repression going into becoming a man and a whole lot of repression going into becoming a woman. And that one of the things we have to do is to conform with existing gender norms, is to rule out all those possibilities of being, feeling, doing, loving that don't line up with the gender norms that are governing our lives. So anthropology, psychoanalysis, they all had their place in that moment way before gender trouble emerged on the scene. I think at the time that I wrote Gender Trouble, people treated gender as if it was a natural fact or a sociological reality, but they didn't treat it as something that you could make and remake. Performance is important to the extent that we do enact who we are. And anybody in performance studies actually knows that there are performances that we do in our lives that are not mere performance, they're not fake. When performative was first coined as a word, the philosopher J.L. Austin was trying to understand legal utterances. So when a judge says, I declare you man and wife, you become man and wife once that declaration has happened. That's not fake. That happened. Now, what if we were to say that in enacting our lives as a particular gender, we are actually realizing that gender anew. We are making something real happen. When gay and lesbian people started coming out, or when trans people started living openly, something changed in the world by appearing, speaking, acting in certain ways, reality changed. And it has changed. We are seeing the changing of terms. We no longer speak about family, woman, man, desire, sex in the same way. Even the Cambridge Dictionary acknowledges that something has changed. Okay, so when we talk about performative, we're talking about an act that makes something come into being or an act that has real consequences. We're talking about the changing of reality. Even among progressive and liberal people I know, there can sometimes be a real resistance to thinking about trans rights or lesbian and gay rights or even women's rights. They sometimes say that these are secondary issues or it simply makes them uncomfortable. Why should I have to refer to someone as a he or a she or a they? And yet, at least in the US, we learned how to talk about Black people differently, or we talk about women differently. And sure, it was probably hard to learn how to use new language. Maybe we had to adjust our habits, but stumbling is part of learning, and making an error is part of learning, especially when we're learning something new. Sometimes we can all be vitriolic. Some certain statements will set me off and I will scream. But if I only were to do that, then I would never be having a conversation with anyone. I think we all want to be the moral center of our universe. Like, that's right, that's wrong. You're canceled, you're not. You're with me, you're against me. But we have to allow ourselves to be challenged and accept the invitation to revise our ways of thinking, because that's the only way of being open to people who are trying to make their claim, sometimes for the very first time, to be heard, to be known, to be acknowledged. Now I'm less interested in defending a theory of gender. I'm much more concerned with finding creative and effective ways of countering the attack on gender. One problem is that many people who refuse to allow trans people to define themselves is that they feel that their own self-definition is destabilized. The idea that we can change reality, transform reality to be more open, inclusive, just, less violent. There's an instability in that that's very frightening to people who want to understand their genders as fixed. But is anybody's gender necessary and universal, or is it a complicated emergence that happens with each of us? Our deepest sense of self is also formed in time, and we can't always know in advance what that will be. Freedom is a struggle because there's so much in our world that's telling us not to be free with our bodies. And if we are seeking to love in a free way, to live and move in a free way, we actually have to struggle to claim that freedom. When we live in a democracy, we assume that we're living according to certain principles: equality, freedom, justice. And yet we're constantly learning what freedom is and what equality is and what justice can be. And those challenges, right? The anti-slavery movement, the suffrage movement, the movement for LGBTQIA plus rights. I mean, each of those struggles involve challenging people's existing ideas of who's equal, who has the right to be free, and how do we define justice? We are all the time struggling to achieve that goal. We need to reoccupy these notions and show that concerns with racial justice and gender equality and gender freedom are an integral part of any democratic struggle, especially if we want to rethink who the people are and what it means for them to live in freedom without fear.
Let's just wrap up the gender stuffs. Unless you want to take a break from gender, we can go back to that. Do you want to let me give you the prompt for the last few
My
minutes?
whole life I've wanted to take a break from gender. I can never take a break from gender.
Get smarter, faster with
So that is a clip of Judith Butler, who has written required reading for this week about hate speech. So, Judith Butler's writing, Burning Acts and Injurious Speech, is part of a longer book called Excitable Speech, which is about hate speech. So, Mary Zaborskis has written about Judith Butler's work and cites Judith Butler's writing in Zaborskis' article regarding hate speech and specifically cyberbullying and cybercrime. Who or what should be held accountable, if at all, for injurious speech? In Judith Butler's Burning Acts, Injurious Speech, she explains that while we think that we are subjects who are responsible for everything we say, in actuality, a community and history of speakers is magically invoked at the moment in which the utterance is spoken. So much like Judith Butler's writings about gender, the declarative performative statement, it's a girl or it's a boy, in the English language, obviously enacts a whole set of performatives that are historically defined by communities of speakers throughout history. If one speaks a different language, obviously there would be a different set of utterances or statements made. And the same is true of the burning of crosses, that when someone uses a cross to signify violence or war against minority groups in the United States of America, this speech act or this act of signification involves a whole history of speakers. In other words, we are not the origin of our thoughts, feelings, and utterances. Every time we think, we speak our own words. The framework and lineage that actually produces those words is hidden. Thus, when it comes to injurious utterances, Butler is concerned with the following. If the utterance is to be prosecuted, where and when would that prosecution begin? And where and when would it end? So, if we think about gender as an example in relation to the burning of the cross, and we use the example of gender because Judith Butler's work is often about gender. And at what point is there a responsibility for socializing someone to be a certain gendered subject? So if someone speaks in a certain way and uses certain gendered language, but even if every person has a set of, say, gendered norms that might annoy others, at what point could someone be held accountable? Is it the responsibility of someone's parents? Is it society? Is it consumerism? Where and when would prosecution begin? In acts of burning crosses, obviously prosecution has to begin. Unlike gender identity, the enactment of whiteness is not just a kind of routine or benign set of performances, a way of speaking, a way of dressing, a way of behaving. The enactment of whiteness becomes an expression of extremism and white supremacy that involves the burning of crosses on people's lawns and particularly Black Americans. So, what interests Judith Butler, though, is how this act of burning a cross could be considered to be free speech, because speech is never free. It always invokes a community of speakers. So when we speak, it is not as though I would just start saying blah, 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 and you would understand or care to. My speech must involve an entire history of forms of elocution that are acceptable in this time period that involve the law and proper uses of language to describe people and things. And my speech acts obviously involve a use of contemporary English language. So can we prosecute history, institutions? Where do we draw a line, if at all, between personal responsibility and inherited structures of feeling and citations? How can we prosecute individuals when dominant orders, for example, the Supreme Court, systematically sanction certain kinds of injurious speech and behavior? Butler thinks that there are probably occasions when subjects should be prosecuted for their injurious words. But she wonders if understanding from where speech derives its power to wound could alter our conception of what it might mean to encounter that wounding power. So, in the case of cross burning, what courts have argued is that one can burn a cross, um, irrespective of the history of the use of the cross burning to terrify predominantly Black homeowners and residents of the United States of America by the Ku Klux Klan. And this is because of the rights to free speech. So in Virginia versus Black, um, the Supreme Court gave a landmark ruling about the burning of crosses. And the Supreme Court of the United States of America stated that any state statute banning cross burning on the basis that it constitutes prima facie evidence of intent to intimidate is a violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Such a provision, the court argued, blurs the distinction between the prescribable threats of intimidation and the Ku Klux Klan protected, quote, messages of shared ideology. So, cross burning, however, can be a criminal offense if the intent to intimidate is proven. So, the actual act of burning a cross is then a protected freedom under the First Amendment in the United States Constitution. And the First Amendment prevents the government from making laws respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the freedom of assembly, the right to petition. So on these grounds, then one can burn a cross. However, cross burning can be seen to be criminal if threats of intimidation can be proven. So in most instances of cross burning in this time period, it is the Ku Klux Klan who burns crosses against Black Americans. So the burning of crosses outside of someone's home or outside of a Black business is meant to signal a dislike of Black Americans and a preference for white Christian America. And the actual signification, the burning of the cross, as I mentioned, is an original act of declaring war, or was an original act of declaring war in Scotland. So it is a warring act. So in the article, Judith Butler then discusses this case, RAV versus St. Paul, in which a young white man burned a cross on the front lawn of a Black family's home. She uses various philosophers and theories to present the difficulty of the case based on the U.S. Supreme Court's decision. The Supreme Court did not condone the actions, nor did it suggest the actions were acceptable. However, it was a case where the evidence did not prove the act to be injurious to the family and fell under freedom of speech guaranteed by the First Amendment of the Constitution. So the biggest problem in these cases is proving intimidation. And this sense that one wants to burn a cross in front of or in proximity to a Black family is obviously about intimidation. However, the law really isn't about morality, and it is not about hatred. It is about proving that someone is guilty rather than an innocent person in North America who can still sell their labor and purchase things to support the economy. Butler also presents various theories on the performativity of words and actions. Performative words communicate an effect, create an emotional response, and are used to affect someone either positively or negatively. So Judith Butler then concludes that injurious hate speech is hate speech, and it does cause emotional, psychological injury in the lives of minorities, and it can also do significant damage to the economy. So hate speech then must be thought of as an act of speech like any other act of speech that involves a history of speakers, that imbues certain signs and signifiers, words and phrases with a great deal of meaning, including the possibility of terrifying others. So Judith Butler investigates the linguistic aspects of censoring homosexuality and homosexual acts in this article. So the article is really a great piece of philosophy and academic scholarship because it is not a polemic. The author really discusses all of the possibilities of speech and hate speech and declaring something to be an act of hate speech that can be censored. And so the examples that Judith Butler also gives are about linguistic aspects of censoring homosexuality and homosexual acts. She suggests that the US military created an atmosphere of paranoia around the regulations of homosexual speech and acts because they were considered taboo by and for those in service. The military viewed homosexuality and homosexual acts as both disruptive and contagious. Butler also argues that the regulations hindered those who identified as homosexual because they could no longer identify with who they were and were required to pretend they were not gay in order to serve. So the problem with censorship of speech acts is that when we speak, we are not just making sounds, we are invoking a whole history of speech. But if I do not like the history of speech that you are making reference to, do I have the right to stop you from speaking? The answer is obviously no, and that is why the court has upheld the First Amendment, because if someone wants to speak about being queer or gay or lesbian or transgender, then this might also not be popular for others, but someone cannot be prevented from speaking. The criminal element obviously involves intent to harm others with one's speech and acts of signification. So the burning of the cross, if it is proven to be threatening to Black people and specifically to Black families, then who are often the victim of these crimes, then cross burning could be seen to be a criminal offense. Judith Butler also then discusses pornography and debates regarding whether pornography could be uh, described as hate speech. And Judith Butler writes, what pornography delivers is what it recites and exaggerates. From the resources of compensatory gender norms, a text of insistent and faulty imaginary relations that will not disappear with the abolition of the offending text, the text that remains for feminist criticism relentlessly to read. So this is another interesting aspect of Judith Butler's understanding of hate speech. If one was to ban pornography or could not see it, would that mean that the depiction and the exaggeration of, say, gendered norms and gendered norms that impact how people imagine sex, would those gendered norms and would those ways of having sex or wanting to have sex change? The answer is perhaps no, that you can ban pornography to the extent that we don't see it. But this kind of exaggeration of gender norms that often exists in acts of sex will still exist. So the feminist reading of pornography only exists because we can actually look at pornography. And so the kind of extreme gender roles and sometimes the even more extreme, like snuff pornography, which depicts the killing of women, is actually a text that we can read. When someone sees a cross burning in the United States of America, all of the ways that people who are polite middle class people have chosen to not talk about race are challenged by these really obvious examples of the continued discrimination of people of color because of racism. So, trying to remove the most obvious forms of discrimination does not change patterns of discrimination. And in actuality, when we try to isolate the kind of most extreme elements of antagonism in society, we might actually make it possible for systemic discrimination to continue without any visual or verbal evidence of continued discrimination. So the Ku Klux Klan is the most extreme example, and the cross burning of the Ku Klux Klan, the ways that the Klan speaks their very white robes, are often seen to be offensive to middle class people. However, this kind of exaggeration does not exist alone. In order for the Klan to have the capacity to do these things, a history of slavery obviously does exist. And the enactment of these processes of signification offers very striking evidence of the existence of anti-Black discrimination and the existence of violence that is informed by the history of slavery. I would argue also that class is central to discussions regarding hate speech and free speech. Pornography is a text that perhaps, and an industry that often perhaps involves people who are working class. And the Ku Klux Klan is often imagined by middle class educated people to be this extremist group that is depicted as insane or pathological. But these exaggerated processes of signification simply gesture to a whole set of gendered norms, hierarchies of skin color and race uh, that do exist and that we participate in and uphold in very banal ways that are often unspoken. So, Michael Banton has written extensively about the social construction of ethnicity and race. And when we talk about race in the liberal arts and humanities, it is often discussed with this scare quotes around it. Race is not real, and philosophers and sociologists, critical race theorists, uh, have all consistently discussed and demonstrated that race is a social construct. So race is not a biological truth that makes certain people radically different from others. It is a historical set of ideas that forms in certain contexts often to and has often formed or was often formed historically to justify slavery, colonial rule, and class antagonism. So Michael Banton writes, possibly the most notable feature of race as a concept is the way that it has inveigled observers into assuming that the main issue is that of the nature of differences between populations, and that they should concentrate upon what race is, as if this would determine the one scientifically valid use of the word. Banton argues then that the ways that people approach race often begins with this idea that there is a thing called race and that race exists. And Michael Banton argues that this is not true. There is no natural uh, or essential difference between people at birth that requires the construction of categories of people who cannot be with each other or speak with each other or have any kind of consensual adult relationship with each other. Physical differences catch people's attention so readily that they are less quick to appreciate that the validity of race as a concept depends upon its value as an aid in explanation. From this standpoint, the main issue is the use of the word race, both in rational arguments and in more popular connections. For people use beliefs about race, nationality, ethnicity, and class as resources when they cultivate beliefs about group identities. So, this cultivation of belief and the use of race as a resource and explanation, I would argue, is about class antagonism. That race becomes a concept that is often used and mobilized to justify class exploitation and antagonism. Race can also be used to then justify solidarity and political solidarity, particularly solidarity of a marginalized class of people. Race is also a heuristic device that can be used in cases of affirmative action. So if one believes that groups of people can only work in certain industries or can only make a certain amount of money, they can use all of these explanations about ethnicity or national origin, skin color to make these justifications. Race can then also be used as a set of legal claims to counter these explanations if they mean that consistently people of color, queer people of color, women of color, people of color with disabilities are consistently discriminated against and cannot earn a significant amount of money with the same qualifications as their white counterparts. So the failure to allow for changes in the sense in which the word race has been used has important consequences. For those who misunderstand the past of their society are likely to misunderstand the present, because people judge the present in the light of what they believe the past to have been. The past cannot be properly understood if changes in the significance of words are not allowed for. Historians and sociologists judge their predecessors, but will themselves be judged by a later generation because they are not standing outside history. Since the limitations of their knowledge will bemuse their successors, they should be charitable in assessing the limitations of their predecessors. Race.
I will protect you. I will protect. You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled Black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you are of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the US needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be Black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous one drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was Black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent. But the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real life experiences. They can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
So this is just the introduction or the first part of the lecture. And in the second part of the lecture, which I will record and send to you, I will discuss these four ideas in detail, and I will give a close reading of the Judith Butler article, which is my interpretation of the text. And I will try to explain some of the concepts and the language that Judith Butler uses. Firstly, performativity. So Judith Butler's writings about performativity, as mentioned, have been well cited in gender studies, and Butler draws on J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words. And Judith Butler really seizes on the do of how to do things with words, and poses the question of performativity as what it means to say that things might be done with words. So doing gender or doing race is really about a linguistic enactment of performatives that has material consequences. The problem of performativity is thus immediately bound up with the question of transitivity. What does it mean for a word not only to name, but also in some sense to perform, and in particular to perform what it names? So doing race, like doing gender, is not innocent. It is not as though we choose to enact enact certain performatives using certain terms outside of history. So if someone is called a certain name, it means that they are categorized in a certain way, and they are categorized in relation to a history of slavery, and they are categorized in relation to a history of colonialism, including settler colonialism and European colonialism. The same is true of gender and the gender binary, that if you're called a woman, then this has a series of consequences in one's life. On the one hand, it may seem that the word, for the moment, we do not know which word or which kind of word, enacts what it names, where the what of what it names remains distinct from the name itself and the performance of that what. After all, J.L. Austin's title queries how to do things with words, suggesting that words are instrumentalized in getting things done. Austin, of course, distinguishes between illocutionary and prelocutionary acts of speech, between acts that are performed by virtue of words and those that are performed as consequence of words. So if we were to, for example, do ethnicity or do race in a context where someone understood the Indian caste system, then the naming of ourselves in certain ways or the naming of others in certain ways could have a positive benefit in certain people's economic status, their employment status. If we could do these things, it would be in violation of the law. But this is really what doing these things with words often leads to. When people do gender and they do race, I would argue they do these things with words, name others, and categorize others for the purposes of their own economic gain. And the kind of identity politics debates and battles that happen in various unions or workplaces, courts of law, even personal relationships are really about who has the power to name and who has the power to use speech to do things for themselves, for others, and against others. So gender performativity is a term created by structuralist feminist philosopher Judith Butler in her 1990 book, Gender Trouble, which has subsequently been used in a variety of academic fields that describes how individuals participate in social constructions of gender. So, self identification of one's gender identity, one's sexuality, one's ethnicity, and race is central to our contemporary schools and workplaces and our contemporary laws. Uh, one has the right to self identify in certain ways, and they can ask others not to use certain language to describe them. Judith Butler writes, is there a way to link the question of the materiality of the body to the performativity of gender? And how does the category of sex figure within such a relationship? Consider first that sexual difference is often invoked as an issue of material differences. Sexual difference, however, is never simply a function of material differences, which are not in some way both marked and formed by discursive practices. So, in the instance of hate speech, we can think about the argument is a really rich philosophical argument that gives us a great deal to think about. That's sexual difference for Judith Butler is marked by a whole series of discursive practices. There is no innate male or female outside of language, outside of history, and outside of political power for Judith Butler. So if we were to think about hate speech, this is also true. And so then we come back to this question of self-definition. If one does not want to identify themselves in certain ways, they do not have to. So you don't have to self-identify in certain ways, but that does not mean that identity exists apart from a history of speakers. So doing or not doing race will not change the history of settler colonialism or slavery. And doing or not doing gender in certain ways does not change a history of sexual harassment, rape, domestic violence, marriage, childbirth, inheritance. The interesting legal question that Judith Butler poses, which is central to the topic of this course about race and crime, is to what extent an individual speaker who tries to do things with signs and symbols, words and crosses and fire can be held accountable for their enactment of a history of crimes against Black Americans from the history of slavery onwards. So the courts are quite clear that unless intimidation of a specific person or family can be proven, that you can burn a cross as an act of free speech and free expression. So in these acts of free expression that one sees repeated on nightly news, in instances of police murder, death, riots, segregation, hate crimes against children, the defilement of the human body, race becomes a norm, and it becomes a norm that is materialized across time and space through these acts of speech. Race is obviously not only materialized through negative acts, it could also be materialized through acts of music or community building, but it becomes a regulatory ideal. So Judith Butler writes that sex is a regulatory ideal whose materialization is compelled, and this materialization takes place or fails to take place through certain highly regulated practices. In other words, sex is an ideal construct which is forcibly materialized through time. One of the reasons that I begin with Judith Butler is that I would argue that race is materialized in gendered ways, and that gender is always racialized. Closely related to race is the class structure in any society. So the ways that gender becomes performed, or the ways that sex becomes a regulatory ideal whose materialization is often concealed under this idea of naturalness, is always also racialized. Another example of historical hate crimes would be lynching. The lynching of young Black men throughout the Americas is one of many hate crimes that takes place or that offers evidence of deep-seated racism in North America. The case of Emmett Till is one of the most widely cited and debated cases within the North American feminist movement. Emmett Till was a young Black man who was accused of rape. And what many feminist commentators and historians have argued is that Emmett Till did not commit acts of sexual harassment or sexual violence, and that he was wrongly accused and killed because he was Black. So the ways that race and gender work together often mean that very simple questions of right and wrong are complicated by intersectional analysis. So our subjectivity is not an independent, self-willed subjectivity for Judith Butler. We do not simply choose to do gender or undo gender. In the same way, we do not simply choose to do or undo race. We may believe that our subjectivity is the source of our actions, but Judith Butler contends that our sense of independent, self-willed subjectivity is really a retroactive construction that comes about only through the enactment of social conventions. Gender cannot be understood as a role which either expresses or disguises an interior self. Whether that self is conceived as sexed or not. A performance which is performative. Gender is an act broadly construed, which constructs the social fiction of its own psychological interior. So if gender is a performance which is performative, if gender is an act, and it constructs these social fictions of its own psychological interiority, then gender is also an act that involves a history of speakers, in the same way that ethnicity and race involve a history of speakers who understand and read the social fiction as a normative set of performatives that give the illusion of a certain form of naturalness. Uh, so one can be part of an ethnic or racial community and not really have anything in common with the people who are part of this community. But there is a history of speech acts which have been gendered in nature. It involved the marriage of certain people and involved family inheritance to pass down through generations, and it then subsequently lead to ethnic communities that exist over generations and often can do business with each other or have a certain role in the class structure. Race no longer exists in the same way that it did in the past, and neither does gender. The idea of a fixed ethnic community that all occupy the same class position is no longer true in our time period. This is also true of gender. The existence of transgender people and queer people, including transgender and queer people of color, make these processes less stable. So I will stop there and I will record the second part of the lecture in a different video. So all of the recorded lectures will be approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes or 1 hour and 30 minutes. Before I finish, I will go back to the course link website and again talk about the requirements for the class and the relationship between the lectures and the assignments. So the first assignment is the take-home test, and the take-home test will be distributed on week 4. And I will post the exact dates online before Monday. And the take-home test will involve a series of short answers. So there will be short answer questions. So you will be asked to define concepts like performativity or hate speech. And these concepts will be taken directly from the first 4 weeks of readings. And you will be given 1 week to upload the answers. If you go here to assignments, I will post all of the assignments here. So that is the first assignment, and it will be around week 4, and I will put the guidelines online. The second assignment will be the presentation. So for the presentation component, what you are asked is to choose one of these week's readings. So you could choose this reading, written by Judith Butler, Burning Acts 1, Injurious Speech in this journal, Performativity and Performance. And you can choose the article and then create a academic presentation around 10 to 15 minutes. It can be more, but a minimum of say 10 to 15 minutes where you discuss one aspect of the reading. And it should be an original discussion rather than a summary. The final assignment will involve choices. You will be given the choice to write an essay. You can also do an alternative assignment. You can design your own topic and design your own assignment for the final assignment. So that is the first lecture and the first half of the first lecture for race, ethnicity, and crime. I hope that you think the class is interesting, and I hope that you enjoy the class and you find it useful for your own intellectual and philosophical development, your own ethical and moral consideration of your place in the world, and your own career aspirations. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.